you have microphone trouble, you can write on the chat a brief introduction. That's great, okay, as well.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, my name is Mfundo Pede Langwenya. I'm with the Eswatini Environment Authority as the Environment Fund Officer. Thank you.
Can I request the other participants to just quickly introduce themselves?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mambo Chiluwe. I'm a consultant doing the cost-benefit analysis for COMESA.
Thank you. I see Nicolette and Gugu. Maybe if you wanted to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicolette Mhlangandlovu. I'm the National Adaptation Consultant engaged by COMESA and PwC. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolette. Has Gugu, have you? Noctula and Payday. Are you with us? I know Gugu is from the university, I think, and Payday is from Eswatini Environment Authority.
Hi,
yes,
everyone. I thought I'd introduce myself. Oh, I can go again.
The UNFCCC focal point has joined, Constance Flamini. Yes, sorry, Gugu, did I cut you off? I didn't hear you. Or Payday, sorry. Yeah, we are just doing introductions, so please go ahead.
My name is Mfundo Pede Langwenya. I'm with the Eswatini Environment Authority as the Environment Fund Officer. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And welcome, Constance, to this meeting. I think we can now beam the agenda for others. And please do fill the form, the registration form that Diego has shared in the chat.
Yes, I think we're good to go, Deepa. If you maybe
Yes.
by the agenda we have an introduction by you, it could be very brief, and then we can start.
Yes. Okay, yeah, all right. So today we are going to look at the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory Development Process for the industrial processes and product use, or IPPU sector. And the team with Diego, Sofia, Gerardo, and also local consultant Tabile Ndlovu have been working on this very hard. And I must say they were one of the first to complete their assignment. So very well done. And thank you so much for organizing this, because as part of the NDC revision, we want to do capacity building in the country. And this workshop is one of the ways in which you are sharing the knowledge that is generated during the NDC process. So thank you for recording it. We can share it with others who are unable to join today. So without further ado, let me hand over to Diego and team to take us through their presentation.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Please confirm, Deepa, that you can see and hear me clearly.
We can.
Okay, thank you. Well, Diego and Gerardo, please, since I will be presenting, if anyone else joins, can you put the link again in the chat so that anyone can register? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as Deepa commented, the idea of this workshop is the capacity building on IPPU sector, on the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory and the short-lived climate pollutants calculation. here. Okay, give me a second. There. Okay. So this is divided in 5 sections of the workshop. First, I will present a brief summary of the results of all the inventory and the calculations. Then I will give a brief introduction to how is a national greenhouse gas inventory calculated, what methodologies are used, and the same for SLCPs and other air pollutants. And then we will go to 2 practical blocks, I'd say, on direct capacity building on the categories that form part of the inventory of Eswatini, both for SLCPs and greenhouse gases. And then there will be a space for questions and final discussion. So I will start with the summary of the results. Please, if you have any questions, you can submit them in the chat, or there will be space for questions in both the practical sections, and at the end of each section, we can have a space for questions as well. So first of all, this is the summary of greenhouse gases of the historical period that is starting from 1990 to 2018. In Eswatini, well, you can see first this gray block at the bottom of the historic emissions. There was a brick production company that was operating in the country that you can see that in 2017 was the last year of production where it halved its production, and then in 2018 it wasn't operating anymore. So that's why this gray contribution isn't in the 2018 year. Then there is a kind of stable contribution of the lubricant use in the country. It has to do with population, so it's growing as population grows, but it's kind of constant, we could say. We will be in the detail of each of the sectors later, the categories. Then electrical equipment, you can see it's constant throughout time. This is the brown bar that you can see, it's the third. It's the same always because it has to do with the sulfur hexafluoride purchase in the country, and it's always the same. It is used in circuit breakers in the electrical equipment. And then, which I think is the most interesting variation throughout the years, you can see the green bars that have to do with all the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. Okay, so this grows in time because of the refrigerant that is contained in equipment that is disposed and is not recovered from disposal sites. So throughout the years, all the equipment that is it meets its end of life, it starts emitting all the refrigerant that it had contained inside the equipment. So that's why we can see it grows through time. Okay, so this is the picture of 2018 and how it is composed. Okay, so the first 3 that I put here are 0. I will explain in a moment why, and I would like to go on with the ones that are not 0. That is the refrigeration and air conditioning. As I mentioned, is the largest contributor, around 68% of the emissions for the last year of the historical period, 2018, with about 12 gigagrams of CO2 equivalent. Then it's followed by lubricant use in almost at 25% of emissions of the IPPU sector, with around 4 gigagrams of CO2 equivalent. Then it's followed by sulfur hexafluoride in electrical equipment. As I said, this is constant through time. At least it has been through a historical period. And then there are 2 small uses of other products, paraffin wax that is contained in candles, and nitrogen oxide from product use. Okay, so this is the total that we can see. It's almost 17 gigagrams of CO2 equivalent. And why are these 3 other categories 0? Well, there is a glass company in Eswatini that uses recycled glass only, and this is a cullet ratio of 1. And this, in the calculation method, this results in no GHG emissions. We will see later that they do have other air pollutants emissions, though. Then the sugar industry that could use carbonates in their process, sodium carbonate, we confirm that they do not use it in their process, so the emissions are 0 as well. And then the brick company shut down in 2017. So these three categories formed part of the historic period, or they are involved in other emissions, but they do not have GHG emissions. So I put them here so that you know that they exist, but they do not contribute to the overall GHG emissions. Okay, so going on with the, okay, yeah, thank you. We'll go by each of the sectors. This is the mineral sector, as I mentioned, the only one that contributes to GHG emissions in the ceramic sector. In the other process use of carbonates in ceramics was the brick company that shut down. So for 2017, it was the last year where it emitted, and in this year, the company halved its emissions, its production, so its emissions as well. And then in 2018, it was 0. Then going on with the other category named the 2D non-energy use of fuels. This is when fuels, in particular lubricant and paraffin wax, in the case of Eswatini, are used for other uses rather than combustion. In this case, it's lubricant used in any type of vehicle, for example. And paraffin wax is the use of candles. This is, as I said, calculated through population data. So this fluctuates as we have different numbers of population for each of the years. Then this is how what I mentioned before of product uses as substitutes for ozone depleting substances or refrigerants in general for refrigeration and air conditioning. This is, I think, the most complex sector of the IPPU categories. As we will see in the particular section for the practical calculation, the other ones are more straightforward than this one. As you can see, the emissions start rising throughout the whole historical period because of the emissions from the disposal sites of equipment that contain refrigerants. Then other process product use, we have two chemicals that are used in this process. One is the, as I mentioned, the sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, in electrical equipment. As you can see, it's constant throughout time. It's always the same quantity purchased by the electrical company. It's 52 kilograms a year. So you can see it's always the same quantity. And then nitrous oxide from product use. This is using the chemical directly in some medical applications and other applications like propellants in the country. So this is the 2G category. And well, there are also other categories that do not emit GHGs. We will see them in the air pollutants section. Also, I want to share this comparison with previous calculations with inventory that was already in place in the country, because we started working with information that was already in place, activity data and some spreadsheets. Okay, so we can see that the differences vary according to the category. Paraffin wax, for example, varied in a 1%. Refrigeration and air conditioning decreased in 28%. Electrical equipment decreased in a 2%. And on the other hand, other product manufacture and use decreased in a 14%. These variations, I'd like to say, also that Tabila, I think, already joined. The calculations were, in general, very well executed. And the variations were mainly due to variations in the global warming potentials that were previously being used. We will mention in a while what variations there were, but they were from previous reports of the IPCC instead of the newer values that should be used. So this also, after we recalculated all the baseline emissions that were the historical data, we projected business as usual emissions with some well, mainly with the GDP projections of the country and with the population projections of the country, like what would IPPU be in the next 10 years or so. These projections were made from 2000, taking 2018 as a baseline year. And then, as I said, we used other input data for the rest of the projection. So you can see the refrigeration and air conditioning keeps growing throughout time. And well, the others have growth related to GDP as well, that is not as notorious as refrigeration and air conditioning because of its larger share of the emissions of the country. But if it followed the projections, the IPPU emissions could grow from what we have in a baseline of 16 gigagrams of CO2 equivalent in the baseline year to up to 37 almost gigagrams of CO2 equivalent in the peak year that it's calculated so far in 2028. So this is the baseline that also in other part of this consultancy was used for estimating the mitigation potential of actions in the sector. Well, that's with GHG emissions. Of course, to mention again, you will have this recording and this presentation in case I went through something very fast and you wanted more detail. But well, I will go with this emissions. First, with just a comment, HFCs are considered in the GHG inventory as well, but they are also short-lived climate pollutants, so we show them here as well. In this case, they are shown in tons, and in the GHG inventory, they are shown in CO2 equivalent. So the emissions in the SLCP and air pollutants, you can see them broken down by HFC. It is mainly dominant the HFC 134A. It's the most largely used refrigerant in the country. As you can see, it's about 10 tons, and the others are in the range of kilograms a year. So this is the most relevant HFC used in Eswatini. Then black carbon, we have about 4.2 tons of black carbon being emitted in the country during 2018. And then particulate material 2.5 is the smallest size of particulate matter. And then non-methane volatile organic compounds, you can see that is the most is the largest number of this category, and it's emitted in a sector that does not emit GHG, that is in the food and beverage sector. It's another category of IPPU, and well, we will see it then in detail, but it has to do with the production of meat, poultry, cakes and biscuits, beer, etc. Okay, and also there are heavy metals being emitted in the country, but very negligible because it's less than 0.4 kilograms each a year. So these are not mentioned here. And well, here is a comment on which are the largest sources of the pollutants. Black carbon and PM 2.5 are mainly related to road paving with asphalt. And the food and beverage industry does not emit GHG, as I mentioned, but it's the largest source of non-methane volatile organic compounds. So the same historical baseline as I projected with GHG emissions is shown here for air pollutants and SLCPs. In the case of IPPU, we have two SLCPs. The first is HFC emissions. As I said, it's largely dominated by HFC 134A, which has almost 10 tons of HFC a year in 2018. As you can see, it grows, of course, because of the same that we already mentioned, related to the emissions from disposal sites of HFC containing equipment. Then the other HFCs are negligible compared to this one. So I will go through them fast, but they are also in the country, HFC 143A. As you can see, it's 0.001 tons, this is about a kilogram a year. And the same happens with HFC 32 and 125, the same order of the number a year, okay? And then going to black carbon, the other SLCP emitted in the IPPU sector. The sectors that are involved in these emissions are road paving with asphalt. This is constant through time, and you can see this is the almost 4 tons a year that are emitted. This is constant because, according to the Ministry of Transportation, we got the data was that 110 kilometers are paved every year. So with that, we calculated the same amount of asphalt being used every year. So that's why that's constant through time. Then the pulp and paper industry, where there's a peak in 1994, where it was the first year of production. But then this the pulp and paper industry shut down in 2011, or no, 2012, I'm sorry, where it stopped emitting, of course. And glass is a very small emitter with less than 4 kilograms a year. So it's negligible really compared to both to road and paving with asphalt throughout the whole time series, and to pulp and paper through the period that it did participate in the inventory. Then the non-methane volatile organic compound emissions from IPPU sector are dominated largely by the food and beverage industry, which is the largest emitter and is responsible for about 97% of the emissions in 2018. And throughout the whole time series is the largest contributor to the emissions. But well, pulp and paper did participate as well to a share of around 3% of its last year of emissions, and about an 8% in the year that it contributed the most. And domestic solvent use is around 3% of the emissions in 2018, and throughout the whole time series, it's always participating in the inventory because there's always domestic solvent use throughout the whole time series related to the population in the country. Then going on to PM 2.5, these emissions have the same distribution than black carbon, because black carbon is estimated from the emissions of PM 2.5. So the sectors that contribute to these emissions are the same: so road and paving with asphalt, constant through time; pulp and paper industry activity data between 1994 and 2011; and glass, that is a fairly small contributor throughout the whole time series. So that's the summary of results. I think the highlights are that in the GHG emissions are the HFC. The HFC contribution is largely dominant, followed by the lubricant use, and then in the SLCPs and air pollutants, we can see that there are other sectors that mainly do not contribute with GHGs, but do contribute in this inventory, that will be road paving with asphalt and other product manufacture and use, mainly the pulp and paper that already shut down, but also the food and beverage industry. So going on with this introduction to GHG and SLCPs and other air pollutants, well, first, a big picture of what are we considering in the inventories. In the right side, we have GHGs, okay, that are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, and hydrofluorocarbons in case of the IPPU sector. The other greenhouse gases do not form part of the IPPU inventory. And in the left side of air pollutants, we can see that of the ones that are present in the Eswatini inventory, we have nitrogen oxides, non-methane volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, and heavy metals, as I said, they are negligible. And short-lived climate pollutants are another kind of climate forcer that some are greenhouse gases and some are air pollutants that these have, in the case of the ones that are also GHG, they have an atmosphere residential time that is very short compared to CO2 of less than 20 years. We will see this detail later. And in the case of black carbon and tropospheric ozone, they are not GHGs. Black carbon is actually particulate matter, but it impacts in the short term in a climate forcing, and tropospheric ozone is formed by other air pollutants and GHG precursors, okay? So how are these calculated and how did we integrate it in the inventory? Well, there are two methodologies, and there are a set of guidelines to follow for a calculation, and there are for all the sectors of economy of a country. Of course, we will be focusing on IPPU. On the left side, we have the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, or the IPCC, as we will be saying throughout this workshop. This is used for calculating greenhouse gases, and the EMEP EEA, or European Monitoring and Evaluation Program, European Environmental Agency. As you can see, it's a long name, so I will be using the short name for it. This methodology is used for estimating the short-lived climate pollutants and air pollutants. And well, in the case, as we mentioned, of HFC and methane, they are both SLCPs and GHGs. In that case, the IPCC methodology is used. And it's important to know that these methodologies are complementary. Actually, the IPCC recommends to use this methodology for pollutants and SLCPs. So there's no problem in estimating an inventory that includes both kinds of pollutants. So a general context on the IPCC. This is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. So they provide calculation guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. These guidelines are allocated in 5 volumes. One is for general guidance, and it's actually called General Guidance and Reporting. It has to do with the best practices for collecting data, how should the quality assessment be developed, how should the reporting be done, and all things that are related to all sectors and not for a sector in particular. Then we have the 4 volumes that are related for each sector in particular: the energy sector, the industrial processes and product use, which we are mentioning, the agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and last, the waste sector, which is the workshop that some of you attended on Tuesday. And which guidelines should be used? If you enter the IPCC guidelines, you can see that the 2006 guidelines are the basis for the calculation of national greenhouse inventories. I left here the links so that when we send this presentation, you can click them if you want to check any of what we are going to be presenting. Well, they were developed almost 15 years ago, so to maintain their scientific validity, some refinements may be required over time. Okay, so some corrections have been done directly into the guidelines. This is the detail of when. You can see that there are 12 corrigenda, and they have been developed from 2007 up to 2020. So even if these were the official guidelines, there have been some corrections done through time. And also the 2019 refinements to the guidelines were created to update and supplement where some gaps have been found, and they should not be used as a replacement of the 2006 guidelines. Rather, it should be used together. Okay, so you would be looking at 2 documents at a time. Sometimes there are no new refinements for the 2006 guidelines in some chapters, or some volumes require more refinements than others, but they are structured in the same way, in the 5 volumes of general guidance and reporting, and one for each sector. So if you are calculating the IPPU sector, you go to the 2009 refinements to the 2006 guidelines of the IPPU volume. Okay, so what are they for, and why are they not corrigenda, as we mentioned before? The corrigenda were mainly corrections of some errors or some new values that were updated directly. But in the case of the refinements, this is supplementary information that wasn't able to be corrected directly. For example, gaps where new technologies were developed in the sector, for example, in the IPPU sector, if new technologies emerged between 2006 and 2019, they would be included in the refinements. Or also, they provide updated default values of emission factors and other parameters that are based on latest available scientific information, where there are significant differences on default values presented in the 2006 guidelines. Or the third case, where additional or alternative up-to-date information and guidance as a clarification or elaboration of the existing guidance on 2006 IPCC guidelines. In particular, of the sectors of Eswatini, included in the IPPU sector, the 2019 refinements are not used in general. Most of the 2006 guidelines are okay for the sectors, mainly because IPPU methodologies are based mostly on the chemistry of the products being used or products main, so that hasn't changed much. What changed is the technologies being used. And in the case of Eswatini, this doesn't impact in the inventory, in the calculation. Also, I'd like to say, well, besides the 2006 and the 2019 refinements being used, which we already mentioned, the UNFCCC common metrics should always be used. These are like general data that should be considered for all national greenhouse inventories of all countries, so that they can be comparable. In particular, what I want to mention here is the global warming potential values, that these have been changing according to the assessment report where they have been published. So this is an example of the global warming potential that were being used before in Eswatini, and the update to the ones that should be used according to the common metrics. So for example, for nitrous oxide, the 100-year global warming potential being used before was from the second assessment report of the IPCC, that was 310, and the fifth assessment report that should be used in the 100-year global warming potential value is 265. So as you can see, it's a bit lower than what you seen before. Also, the sulfur hexafluoride, 100-year global warming potential that should be used is a bit lower than the one that was being used before, that was from the fourth assessment report. As you can see, the difference is about a 23,900, and here it's 500. And the HFC 134A, also the global warming potential varied from 1,300 to 1,120. So this was from the fourth assessment report as well. Also, what should be considered is that key sectors and categories should be determined before building the national greenhouse inventory. This has been done before, so what I am presenting here is actually the key categories of the IPPU sector, and the general guidance on reporting should be used for all sectors. And this, well, was already mentioned, but it's not, I'll mention again, 2006 and 19 refinements should be applied for all categories being used as together, not as a replacement of the former, okay? Well, going on with what are the calculation tiers. Tiers are basically the level of methodological complexity that is being used for a category, okay? So the most simple approach is the tier 1, and it uses more default values and general data, for example, production, instead of going into the specific technology that was used for producing a product. But it's sufficient for non-key categories or when detailed data is unavailable. Tier 2 is an intermediate level of complexity. It can use, for example, instead of default values and default emission factors, it can be using regional or local emission factors or technology-based emission factors, and so on. And tier 3 has a higher methodological complexity. These calculations are more representative of reality in general. And actually, most 2019 refinements to the IPCC guidelines are tier 3 methodological updates. Okay, so this is an example taken from the metal industry and lead production, actually. And it shows the uncertainty ranges from each tier. Okay, so if we go to tier 1, we see that the data source is national production data, for example, the total lead production of the country. It would have a default emission factor and emission factors by process type, or if you know which is the different process that produce lead in the country. The uncertainty range is from 10, 50, and 20% for each of the data source that would be used for estimating this category in tier 1. If, on the other hand, we go to tier 3 category methodology, we can see that it would be facility-specific data. You would go to each of the companies that produce lead in the country and have facility process materials data, specific measured CO2 data, measuring, for example, the carbon content of the chemicals being used, and facility-specific emission factors related to the technology being used. And the uncertainty range is much lower. It goes from 10, 50, and 20 to 5, 5, and 5. So we could see that tier 1 is a bit less representative, maybe, because it has a higher uncertainty range, but it's easier to implement the calculation. And tier 3 is more representative and more intensive in resources, of course. You need more resources for data collection, more time for doing this, more people probably. And of course, that no approach is wrong. All tiers are accepted methodologies, and all tiers are okay for estimating the national greenhouse inventory. But it would be with higher or lower uncertainty. And well, we're going now to the EMEP EEA guidelines. In national greenhouse gas inventories, GHG precursors are required to be included, which are carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen, non-methane volatile organic compounds, and sulfur dioxide. The IPCC actually redirects to these guidelines. As I mentioned before, they are compatible. They do not compete. So this is great for us, that we have to check only one of the two methodologies according to what we want to calculate. And the 2019 edition of the guidebook replaces all earlier versions. This is different from the IPCC, where we have to use the 2006 and 2009 together. In the case of the EMEP guidelines, we use only the 2019 edition. And these provide calculation methodologies for all IPCC sectors: energy, agriculture, IPPU, and waste, and an additional chapter for natural emissions of volcanoes and forest fires. So additionally to GHG precursors and indirect GHG emissions, which are required by the IPCC to be included in the GHG inventory, the EMEP EEA guidelines provide also guidance on the calculation of other air pollutants and short-lived climate pollutants, which we included in the inventory so that we could have a larger spectrum of all the pollutants being emitted in the country. Maybe I mentioned this before in the introduction, but well, SLCPs are a group of climate forcers that have a near-term warming impact on climate and air quality. So the SLCPs are black carbon, methane, tropospheric ozone, and hydrofluorocarbons. In the particular case of IPPU in Eswatini, we have only black carbon and hydrofluorocarbons. As you can see, the lifetime in atmosphere it varies from days and weeks in case of black carbon and tropospheric ozone to 12 years and 15 years in hydrofluorocarbons. The impacts they have local and regional impacts, and in the case of methane and hydrofluorocarbons, they have global impacts because they are GHGs as well. So as I mentioned before, and I will stress a bit, methane and hydrofluorocarbons are calculated already in GHG inventories, and the EMEP EEA guidelines provide additional guidance on black carbon and tropospheric ozone. Okay. The EMEP EEA guidelines in particular, well, this is already what I said, and the rest for air pollutants, the guidelines follow the same logic than IPCC guidelines. The emissions are estimated by multiplying activity data and emission factor, and the tiers being used are the same logic than IPCC. Tier 1 uses default data up to Tier 3 that uses site-specific or technology-specific or product-specific information, depending on what type of sector or category we are calculating. So how do we use the guidelines? First, I will start with the IPCC. Step 1 would be to look for the 2006 guideline volume that you require. This will help understanding the methodology in general, know the availability of default values and the emission factors units that will be used. This will be also important for knowing what activity data you will have to collect. Okay, this I would recommend, and here is in the note, you should not immediately use the guideline since refinements could have been developed. So you should go to step 2, which is reviewing the 2019 refinements to 2006 guidelines for each chapter. So having two volumes of the two volumes and the two chapters that you are using at the same time, you will see if you will require or not the refinements. Maybe the refinements are only for a higher tier of calculation and you won't need them. Or maybe the refinements have some comments that will help you complement the original 2006 guidelines, okay? So in each case, you will have to check whether there are refinements or not applicable for the country. I know that we are a bit past time. We started a bit later, but this block is ending soon, okay? Then how to use the EMEP EEA guidelines? Well, as I said, this replaces all previous volumes. So in this case, you should only use the 2019 technical guidance. And for each chapter, it has the same structure than the IPCC. Here, for example, this is a screenshot of the different chapters of the IPPU sector. We have mineral products, chemical industry, metal production, etc. And usually the same activity data that you use in the GHG calculation is being used as well for the air pollutants and SLCPs. So you shouldn't require additional data in general, but you should check always when compiling the file and collecting data at the beginning of a new period. You should check both guidelines, IPCC and EMEP, so that you make sure that you do not need any additional activity data for any category. Okay, so well, the next section we will present the estimation methods for the category applicable to the sector, with the following structure in general. What are the applicable methodology according to 2019 refinements to 2006 IPCC guidelines? And in the case of sectors that do not have any GHG, we will see also the air pollutants and SLCPs. What activity data is required? What are the emission factors being used? And then the calculation tool will be presented. For each of the categories, we will show the compilation file, how is it used, how does it work, Also, any questions that you may have are more than welcome in any case. And in general terms, I will show now the compilation file very briefly and the general content that it has. Okay, so we have in the country, there's an individual compilation file for each of the sectors. I will be showing only the IPPU compilation file. It gathers the information to be collected, the activity data for each category of the sector, and the emission factors. The emission factors are already embedded for all the categories that are going to be calculated in Eswatini, and the calculation method used for each that are applicable. Tier 1, 2, or 3. In the case of IPPU, we only have tiers 1 and 2 being used. Okay, so we have a general section of parameters, constants, emission factors, global warming potentials, etc. Then the GHG summary, which is basically the same results that I showed you at the beginning of this session, where we saw the tables and graphs. And there's a equivalent tab for SLCPs and their pollutant summary, and calculation sheets, one per category. Also, there are additional tabs in case we need, for example, population data or something specific for any category. So I will show briefly this introduction to the compilation file, because when we go then to each of the categories, we will go straight forward to the specific tab. So allow me to extend myself in 5 more minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute break, and the other blocks will be a bit shorter each of the session. Okay. So the first and overall sheet of this compilation file is a quality assessment sheet, where, well, I would like to say this was already built for Eswatini. We built upon this, so this was kept, and it has to do with who are the compilers, what are the protocols for color coding. Tabila, you can see your name here. Well, maybe we should update this with the latest version. That would be my name probably, but I would like to see it with Tabila as well. There are some notes on how does the inventory sheet work, the sheet structure. Here is, for example, some explanations on how to add additional years, how to add additional sources and pollutants, how to use the lookups, which is a formula of the calculation sheet. It looks, for example, a value in other tabs or in other columns. So how does that work? So basically, this is a sheet for explaining how to use the document. This check library was a checklist of quality assessment and quality control for complying with the principles of reporting, which are transparency, consistency, completeness, comparability, and accuracy. So this should be checked every year if the data being used is appropriate, if the units are appropriate, etc. Okay, and then going on to what is used for the calculations, we have a parameter sheet, which you can see here, for example, the global warming potentials being used throughout the whole document. The conversion factors, these are for converting, for example, from kilograms to tons or days to years, that kind of conversion that has to do more with mathematical approaches rather than something related to pollutants or GHGs. And then, yes, for all the different sectors, we have these are examples, for example, for cement production, which is not applicable for Eswatini, but all emission factors and constants are contained in this sheet. And then we go to the two general summary sheets that are first the GHG summary. You can see that this is for each of the sectors: mineral, non-energy uses of fuels, F-gases, other product use, for example, 2G. And you have all the categories contained in the sector. The historic emissions go from 1990 to 2018. You can see here. This also contains the projection of business as usual emissions or baseline emissions. Then we have the total IPPU sector emissions in terms of gigagrams of CO2 equivalent. And then you have all the tables and charts and graphs that we showed at the beginning of this session. You can see here for 2018, you can change the year and show whatever you like. Also, you have the, yes?
Sorry, we are just watching your presentation, the PowerPoint.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, thank you for correcting. I will stop sharing and share again then.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Let me. Okay, so well, what I said, I will go briefly what you already heard me, but I want to show you. So I believe now you can see. This is, as I said, the first sheet. You put the name of the people involved, the date. This is the protocol for color coding the different sheets. There is also a sheet for taking notes for inventory compilers, and as I mentioned, the instructions for how to add new data, new additional years, how to use the different functions of the Excel sheet, some formulas that are included in the inventory. Okay, then this check library, as I said, is used for the quality assessment and quality control checklist for complying with the QA and QC principles of GHG inventories: transparency, consistency, completeness, comparability, and accuracy. It has to do with if the units are incorrect in the correct value, if activity data sources are correct, how is the uncertainty being carried out, etc. Then the parameters, as I mentioned, this has the global warming potentials and all parameters of emission factors being used for each of the categories. And then GHG summary. This is really, well, the results that you have already seen are contained in this tab: historical emissions, the charts and tables, etc. And all of these are built with the input that is shown here, the summary of emissions that I will zoom in a bit. For example, this is the IPPU category. The sectors in GHG emissions are this that we already know. The time series is from 1990 to 2018. The pollutants contained are CO2, HFCs, SF6, and N2O. The last edition was done by me. You can see my initials here in this date. The status, this is the final 2018 National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And this is the summary for all emissions. So the calculator, what it does is to look up this in all of the tabs. You can see here at the bottom that we have mineral, non-energy use, 2F, 2G, 2H. All the sectors have their individual tabs. And this GHG summary and the SLCP summary, which is the same structure that I just showed you, they get information from the other tabs. So this is the general structure, and then we will dive into the particular structure of the sectors now that we will continue with the other parts of the workshop. Now we will have a short 10-minute break. I will stop sharing my screen and share the 10-minute break projection. Give me a second. Okay, now I believe that you are going to be able to be seated. Okay, so we went just through the first part of this workshop. Now we are on a 10-minute break. I know this is a bit late. We should be back together at 3:17, if that's okay with you. As I said, we earned a bit of time seeing this brief introduction to the calculation tool now, so we will end right on time anyway. So I will give you 10 minutes of break, and then we will go to part 1 of reviewing the categories 2F and 2H. Thank you very much. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Hello, I hope everyone's back from your break. We're starting, I think, now. Well, I can't see you, but I am assuming that everyone is back, and we are going to get started with part one of the more practical review of the categories of the IPPU sector, which are the first two that we're going to review are 2F and 2H. Okay, so here, well, capacity building on, as I said, 2F and 2H. These are the categories related to refrigerators and air conditioning in 2F, in this type of equipment, and 2H with our process product uses, and in particular manufacturing of process. And it's we will see it has to do with the food and beverage industry. Let me see if Deep, are you there? That and you can confirm that you can hear me well, because I got a message that I have trouble with my connection. Or anyone from my team?
You have a bit of delay for a while, but I think now it sounds properly.
Okay, thank you. In any case, in a moment, I am not being heard correctly, and you're having trouble.
We can hear you.
Okay. In any case, let me know if it's in a moment I have a bit of unstable internet connection, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Also, starting with the category 2F of product uses as substitutes for ozone depleting substances, or as a general context, ozone depleting substances that were used in the past, and actually Eswatini has been very successful in phasing out all of these ODS. They have been replaced for other alternatives such as HFCs, which have a very high global warming potential. Okay, the IPCC guidelines used for estimating this category are the Chapter 7, called Emissions from Substitutes from ODS. This chapter does have 2019 refinements. Here are the links for both 2006 and 19, and as well as refining some of the general methodology. There's no very relevant change between 2006 and 19. The IPCC developed a tool for using the Tier 2B mass balance approach, which basically is, we will show it later when we see the calculation. It's a way of estimating annual emissions based on a mass balance of imports, exports, production, and how is the total HFC in the country being used both in servicing equipment that is already in the country, such as filling new equipment, and the leakage from use, okay? And of course, the emissions from the disposed equipment, okay? So this tool is very useful, and it was used in the case of Eswatini. It's delivered by IPCC as a spreadsheet, and should be used for each of the different applications of HFCs. So you would have to use it for mobile air conditioning, for industrial refrigeration, for commercial refrigeration, for domestic refrigeration, etc. It would be desirable to use one for each, and for each type of refrigerant. In the case of the inventory, we only had information of the different type of refrigerants, but not the applications. So, well, we will see that later. And for understanding the emissions from this category, they arise from three stages mainly, okay? So filling of new equipment, new refrigerators or air conditioning equipment that comes in the country and has to be filled with these gases. Then the servicing of existing equipment. This is that during the use, there's some leakage from the equipment and it has to be replaced. So this is servicing. And emissions from disposed equipment. Okay. In the case of disposed equipment, potentially HFCs could be recovered and recycled and reused into existing equipment. So these emissions could also be reduced by practices that could be implemented in the country. It is desirable at least 15 years of historic data for estimating end-of-life emissions, because the best practice according to IPCC guidelines is to assume that after 15 years, the equipment is disposed or replaced or so on, but it's not longer in use. And in the case of these calculations, after it's no longer in use, all refrigerants are emitted with no recovery, since there are no HFC recovery practices currently in place in the country. Okay, so what activity data do we need for estimating this category, and what are the potential sources of information? Well, first, the imports and exports of HFCs. This can be obtained from the Customs Agency of the Swaziland Revenue Authority. And also, it was very useful, a survey that the National Ozone Unit developed in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. So I would say these are the two largest sources of information that could be useful for the inventory. Also the production. There is a company in the country, I assume all of you or most of you do know it, called Pulfridge, that produces refrigerators, but all the production is mainly exported and not domestically sold. Okay, then the applications of refrigerants. Where is the refrigerants and the equipment that we are importing being used? In industry, commerce, infrastructure, all the different type of stakeholders that could participate of this type of service could provide information so that you could have a local distribution of the uses of equipment, and well, the types of HFC used in each type of equipment. Also the practices during servicing. For example, if it's recovered instead of only replaced and so on, this could impact on the emissions during servicing. And finally, the practices during end-of-life recovery of disposed equipment, if there's anything in place regarding the recovery of HFCs. Okay, so in this case, the environmental authority or other authorities engaged with waste or HFCs could be engaged for collecting information regarding any recovery practices that could be in place in the country. So, and all of this data is important that it should be collected per type of refrigerant and use, especially per type of refrigerant, because the different type of HFCs have different global warming potentials. So it would be desirable to have a distribution. Then, well, going on with the second category that we're going to review in this section is category 2H, named Other Industry Production. This category does not have GHG emissions, only GHG precursors. And for this reason, we should only consult the EMEP EEA 2019 guidebook, going directly to the sectoral guidance chapters, to the IPPU, chapter 2.H, Other Industry Production. Okay, and in this chapter you will find that only two categories are applicable to the country. And the reason why I am including the pulp and paper industry, even though the company shut down, is because, well, we read that there were some intentions of reopening the company. So in case the sector starts operating again, this should be consulted for calculating the emissions. In any case, the calculation tool has already got the emission factors and what activity data should be collected for the pulp and paper industry. So if the company starts operating again, you would have no problem in integrating it into the calculation. Then the food and beverage sector has its own guidance as well. And this would be the 2 chapters that you would need. And in this case, we will only review the food and beverage sector, because it's the only one that is actually emitting in the country right now and actually forming part of the inventory. But I will leave as reference the pulp and paper industry as well. So what kind of information? Well, in the case of pulp and paper, well, in both, you would need the annual production of each type of product, which could be mostly delivered by local industry. It would be desirable to contact directly each industry, each company, or the Swaziland Revenue Authority or National Statistics on Production. Okay, so in the case of pulp and paper, you would need quantity of air-dried pulp produced. And in the case of food and beverage, we would have to, ideally, and actually in the case of Eswatini, it's possible to have it by type of product. These are all the types of products in the food and beverage sector included in the country. Alcoholic beverage production, which has spirits and beer, sugar, bread, cakes and biscuits, meats and poultry, and animal feed. In any case, if there's additional information that you could gather or on other produced food and beverage products, it's possible to be grouped by, for example, kilograms or tons or liters of production. In case you are not able to distinguish what kind of production it is. In any case, the only difference would be the emission factor would be an average value that has that the guideline has for estimating non-methane volatile organic compounds independently of the type of product. In the case of having each of the products, it's better because it has a more specific emission factor according to the produced good. Okay, so well, this session is being recorded for future review. As we have mentioned before, we'll review the compilation file in general. I did a very small comments before on the compilation file, but I would like to see some things again. In case it was too fast, I only wanted to introduce it in general before. And then we will go straight to these 2 sheets, okay, 2F and 2H. So I think I will have to stop sharing and share again so that we do not have the problem that I had before. I just realized I'm not with video, so you can see me. Okay. 1 second. I don't know because why I'm having trouble sharing. Okay. I think now you should be able to see my screen.
Right.
In any case, thank you, Diego, for confirming. Well, as I said, well, we are starting from like the end of the numbers of the category 2H and 2F. These are the most, I think, resource intensive, and particularly 2F. That's why I wanted to start with this one. Well, you are already know what's in this compilation file. I will not go through the general sheets. Yes, I will remind you that the GHG summary tab, what it does, it's collect information from other tabs. For example, if we go to we are now in 2F gases. I'm seeing here 2F1, in particular 2F1, refrigeration, air conditioning, etc. You can see that there's a formula here. What this formula does, in a very simple explanation, it's that it does a search of everything you have in the column A, in this case 2F gases. Okay, so it will search in the tab named 2F gases, which is this one. It will search for this name. Okay, so this is related to this type of refrigerant. Okay, so whatever we do in the specific tabs of calculation of each category, the calculation tool will automatically search for it and bring it back to the summary, and you will be able to see the summary with all the categories of the sector, okay? And the same works for SLCPs. I don't think it's relevant to explain it in a different way for this type of pollutants, but only so that you know, in the case of GHG, the summary is in terms of CO2 equivalent. You can see here they are all independently of the type of pollutant expressed in gigagrams of CO2 equivalent. And then in SLCPs, we have them expressed in per type of pollutant. Here it's in tons of HFC. Here you will see it in tons of black carbon, in tons of non-methane volatile organic compounds, in tons of TSP, and so on. Okay, and here you will find the GHG precursors that I would like to comment as maybe it was a detail and not something very memorable, but in general, GHG inventories are supposed to always include the GHG precursors. That including this, we have grouped them here with the air pollutants because in this case we have a larger inventory that has GHGs and air pollutants. In case you ever were to develop only the greenhouse gas inventory, you will have to include this and the non-methane volatile organic compounds with the GHG summary. That is what I put here, expressing in what kind of units they are calculated. Okay, so I will go on now with the 2F gases category, which I think is the most challenging and also the largest source of GHG emissions in Eswatini. And I think it's a bit more methodologically complex in general terms, but any question, please. This is space for asking, and anything you need, you can ask me. And if you have any doubts later, you can also ask after this recording if you are reviewing it, or if you need to send me an email, there's no problem. I would like to insist that this tool is for you to use in the future. So in any case, if you have any comment or any doubts, there's no problem in contacting me with whatever you need, okay? So the first that you will see when you enter any type of any sheet independently of the category, you will see that you have the emission factors and constants needed for this sheet. In this case, we have the global warming potentials. Let me give me a sec. I need to. Okay. I will hide this so you can see more clearly. Okay, so we have the emission factors. In the case of HFCs, all we need is the global warming potentials. We will need the amount of HFC in terms of mass, in terms of kilograms, but these conversion factors are the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of each type of refrigerant. You can see, for example, 134A has a GWP of 1,120, and HFC 32, to give another example, is 677. So after the emission factors, that actually these should not change unless there's a six assessment report of the IPCC and the common metrics say that you should use those GWPs instead. You should keep these global warming potentials. And then in the particular case of this sector, for all others, you would have to insert activity data directly into. As I mentioned before, the IPCC has a tier 2 methodology for collecting data. We will see now. I will give the example for this refrigerant that is the most relevant of the country, HFC 134A. So we have a separate activity data sheet for this one. And what this does basically is a mass balance. I know this is maybe overwhelming, a lot of columns, but please stay with me for a minute. I think will be very easy to understand in the long run. Okay, so what we have, I will start by the end. I will start by the emissions that are allocated in this category. Okay, so the total emissions that we can see is the column U. Total emissions are, give me a second. Okay. Total emissions are represented by 3 numbers. Okay, what I maybe mentioned before, emitted at the end of life of equipment, when equipment is no longer used after 15 years, it's disposed, and all the HFC contained in the equipment is released. Okay, so the first here, the last actually, it's emitted at the end of life. Then we have all the emissions from equipment in use and what is emitted during the filling of new equipment. Okay, so in any case, for all years, you will have that the total emissions of each type of refrigerant, this sheet is only for 134A, will be related to these 3 large categories of emissions. Okay, so now we will break down each of them. Okay, how is the emissions during filling of new equipment estimated? How are the emissions from equipment in use estimated? And at last, how are the emissions at the end of life estimated? Okay, so what is in gray are all calculations done directly from the calculation sheet, and you should not change these columns. You can see that they have formulas and they have some sums or divisions in this case. This has to do with the emission factor for filling of new equipment per year. So all of this these columns, you should not touch them, and what you should use is the all the columns in yellow, okay, which are these 2 and these 4, okay, and these 5 actually. In particular, what is in orange is information that we did not have, so we had to interpolate it. That's why it's in orange, but in a perfect world, you would always have the information and you would always be able to fill all of these cells. Okay, so actually all you need to collect as activity data for each type of refrigerant would be what is produced in the country, what is imported in bulk, this is in large containers, for example, what is exported in bulk as well, and what is imported and exported in equipment. This is, say, you import a refrigerator that already has HFC in the equipment, or what is produced in the country. The refrigerators produced by Puffridge already have HFC in the equipment. Okay, so as you can see, well, this is in particular the imports are estimated. I think it's a bit broader than what we have to review here, but this has had to be estimated from an export bulk analysis. But in any case, all you would have to do would be to collect what is produced in the country, what is imported in the country, both in bulk and in equipment, and what is exported in bulk and in new equipment. Okay, so these 5 values would be like the keys to estimating the emissions from the use and from the filling and the servicing. Okay, and then it would be important to know what is destroyed. Destroyed would be that you recover part of the HFC contained in disposed equipment, and when you recover, you destroy the HFC in a controlled process where it's not emitted to the atmosphere. Okay, in the case of Eswatini, this is not used. Okay, and also this column is 0 for all the time series, which would be that you use any equipment, you use it, and then you export it used, like second-hand refrigerators or air conditioning equipment. In the case of the country, this is not included either. So all the other calculations are estimated based on the production, imports, and exports. I think that's the only really relevant data. And of course, if you could have more detailed information on, for example, emission factor for filling of new equipment. This, as I mentioned, is for a refrigerant in particular. So an improvement of this sheet would be if we knew what kind of equipment was being filled with this refrigerant. For example, if we could separate this sheet that is for the 134A, we could split it into the different uses that 134A has for mobile air conditioning, for domestic refrigeration, for industrial refrigeration. If we had different types of the uses of the refrigerant, we could have a better idea of what is the emission factor for filling. Okay. Also, the emission factor for equipment in use, which is how the percentage of the HFC that the equipment contains, how much of it is being leaked to the atmosphere only by use. Okay, so this emission factor is being both of the filling and for equipment in use. They are both being considered as general emission factors for any type of equipment, and it would be a lot better if we could have a detail on the type of equipment. It would be more representative of reality. Okay, and then the lifetime in years. This is this is a comment by Tabile actually. Average based on IPCC guidelines. Yes, it is. It's a recommendation to assume a 15-year of lifetime. And this is the share of HFC that is being retired, recycled or reclaimed. Okay, so this would be if when any type of equipment meets its end of life, before being disposed or being, for example, dismantled for the pieces or anything, the refrigerant would be collected, and then it could be actually used again if it's recovered and recycled. Okay, in the case of the country, this is currently 0. There is no recovery. So if this changes in the future, you would have to change this cell as well. So as a general summary of what is relevant to collect and what is relevant to do in this sheet, you would have two. If you have the specification of what type of equipment is the refrigerant being used, break this sheet down into the different uses that it has. Okay, and for each you would have to change this emission factor to a more representative one. Actually, the IPCC has different emission factors for filling according to the type of equipment, which is already also commented for the equipment in use. How much does it leak to the atmosphere during use? Then lifetime in years, I would suggest to keep it unless there are any corrigenda or any additional guidelines that suggest to change this lifetime to another number. And then you should change also the amount of HFC being recovered in case there is any recovery practices in the country. Okay, so if you change this, this is the step 1 that you had to update. And then what is to be collected every year would be based on the production, imports, and exports. Production in the country, imports in bulk and in equipment, and exports in bulk and in equipment. So it's 5 types of 5 numbers that you should collect yearly. Then what is destroyed, it has to do with if there are any practices of destroying what is recovered, actually. So if there's no recovery, there would be no destruction probably of the gases. And what is exported in used equipment, this would only apply if it would only be applicable if any of the equipment in use in the country would be exported as a second-hand product to another country, for example, a neighboring country. Okay, so that's how the sheet works. I think the calculation is a bit more complex than others because it's not only the delivering one activity data. It's 5 numbers that you should have to collect, plus the different 4 parameters of the emissions and lifetime and recovery. And then these 2 that I don't think that they would apply for the country, at least in the short term. So 5 activity, 5 data that you should collect, and these 4 factors. Okay, and this is the same actually for all refrigerants. It's not, I think, worth it going through all of them, because the way of estimating this is the same. You can see that we have for the 4 types of refrigerant the same structure, which is provided by the IPCC actually. So I think we are okay with this, and if there are no questions regarding HFCs, we can go on to the other category. Well, I assume not, but of course, please feel free if you have a doubt afterwards to write it down or to send it to me. There's no problem. I would be happy to answer. Okay, so in the case of the 2H other category, as I said, I will not focus on pulp and paper industry since that has already shut down, but it's available for you to use it in case this company starts again or if the sector is activated again. Okay, then we have the activity data. Actually, this have an activity. It was missing a T. This is the activity data for all the food and drink sectors, all the food and beverage. Okay, so what we have of production in the country has been collected by, well, it was in previous inventories, and also there was historic data having a separate tab. But when we did not know the numbers, we estimated between the numbers that we did know. Okay. So we are considering here spirit, beer, sugar, bread, cakes and biscuits, meat and poultry, and animal feed. Why are these grouped together? Well, because we had the possibility to collect the data independently. And as I mentioned before, the EMEP guidelines provide a tier 2 emission factors for estimating the emissions if you have the different products that are made in the country. Okay, so, well, here there are the emissions factors for the pulp and paper industry, that, as you can see, there are a lot of different pollutants. We have oxide, nitrous oxides, carbon monoxide, non-methane volatile organic compounds, sulfur dioxide, and all the particulate matter emissions, including black carbon. All of these are included here. The first, all of them are in terms of kilograms per, I will expand this a bit, kilograms per ton of air-dried pulp, except of the black carbon that is usually estimated as a percentage of particulate matter of 2.5 diameters or less. Okay, so this is for the pulp and paper industry. You can see the emission factors are the same throughout the years. And for the food and beverage industry, we will have only emissions from non-methane volatile organic compounds, which are expressed in kilograms of this pollutant per representative unit of production, hectoliters, liters or tons. Okay, and now I will proceed to show you how is this estimated, because we have activity data here. Here it's 0, but in the time series we can see, for example, from here, okay, sugar, for example, you can see sugar production, how it evolves during the years, and all of the type of products that are produced in the country, except for here that the pulp and paper industry the 2010 was the last normal year of operation. 2011, it produced half of the last year of operation before it closed down and stopped operating in 2012, having no more emissions. That's why I mentioned that we would focus only in the emissions from the food and beverage industry. Okay, so after you would have to insert all activity data here in the year that you want to estimate. Here it is in orange because it's estimations. We projected it from 2019 to 2030, okay, based on GDP. But this should be replaced for actual data. When you do have the numbers of the activity data for each type of production, you should insert that number here and replace the projection for the real numbers, okay? So actually what this does, the calculation, you have the activity data for each year, then you have the emission factor for each year, for each type of pollutant. This does not change for each type of pollutant over the years. And then you have the emissions estimation for each type of pollutant, for each type of product. It's just a multiplication from the emission factor that is here for the conversion of units if you need it. In this case, we want to express it in terms of tons, and from the activity data that is applicable to that year. And then these results, what you see here as the calculation of the activity data by the emission factor, is what is actually shown here in the SLCP and air pollutant summary. When you go to non-methane volatile organic compounds emissions, you will find that all the 2H other emissions are here: spirit, beer, sugar, bread, cakes, meat, animal feed. You will have the description of each. And as I said, this formula does it by itself. All you need is to keep this number, this name, that is what it looks in the sheet. And with this, it will look, okay, I will have to go to sheet 2H to look for this name. And it goes to this sheet, for example, this sheet, and it looks for this code. This code is actually, as you can see, it's a code based on the sector, emissions, the name of the product, the type of emission, and the units that the pollutant is. And after you provide this code to the calculator, which is here, it will look here in this tab, as I said, looking for this code, and will provide everything that is to the right of that code. That is the code of the sector, the name of the sector, what metric, the emissions, what description, its spirit, what pollutant, non-methane volatile organic compounds, in what units is it expressing in tons, and then it will show it for all the time series to the right. Okay, as you can see, this formula keeps appearing on top of my screen because it's the same. What it changed is for what year it's estimating it, and so on. Okay, I hope that's clear. I will go back to a bit only in two gases that I didn't comment. As I said, how it is calculated. Okay, I think you got it. And in this case, it's estimated in rows. Okay, activity data for each year is going down in the calculator, and then in the F gases sheet, it's imported as you can see here. It's the activity data that it's for example, HFC 134A, and this is importing it from the sheet called R134H, which is the refrigerant sheet that I already looked. But it's what it does is that it looks down and copies what is to the right. So we are inserting directly the emissions here from what we saw in the other sheet. That's what actually the formula does. It just imports the information, and it's already done so that you have no problem in adding new years. because this imports according to the year the emissions from the other sheet. So you will have no trouble with that. Okay, so I think that's all. Sorry for going back to this. I just wanted to make that comment. That's all regarding the practical training with this calculator and what does it do with the categories 2F and 2H. I would love to know if anyone has any type of question or comment or any doubt that I could solve. If not, we will take the second 10-minute break right now. And we can proceed then with the second and final stage of the workshop. Okay, so I will give you 10 minutes of break, and we will be back for the last part of the workshop, where we will share we will review the categories 2A, 2D, and 2G. I think we are okay with this. Is, I think the time is wrong here. It should say 15 for you. Okay, I will give you until it will be I'm seeing with Chilean time. I think Diego told me to say this, but I will see you in 10 minutes. Okay.
It's 4 p.m. now, so we'll meet up at 4:10.
In 4:10, we will start the
4:10,
second
yes.
part. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, hope you're back from the break. Now we're going with the last part of the capacity building. Okay, that will be the review of categories 2A, 2D, and 2G. So the first of these three categories that we're going to review is
Are we all back? We can start.
went down for a bit. Actually, my name was changed as well. I hope you can hear me now. Now I'm back. Sorry for the technical inconvenience. Now I will share my screen again and go on with the presentation.
Sophia?
Yes.
Some problems with the bandwidth, so maybe it's better to just turn off your video.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, hopefully now it will work just fine. I don't know where did you lose me, but we're going to review three categories here: the mineral industry, non-urgent use of lubricants, and other use of products. Okay, the first, the mineral industry. There are no 2019 refinements to the 2006 guidelines, and there are also air pollutants emissions related to this category. These are the links to the chapters. Starting with mineral industry, what we have here is the category glass production. The activity data, there's only one company that produces glass, that is Ungüenya Glass, that they disclose their production and they have delivered it for the previous inventory, so there's no problem in compiling it. And what you also need is the amount of recycled scrap glass used in the process, which is the code radio as it is mentioned in the IPCC. And the technology used in the process, well, in this case, it's a very like artisan-made glass, so this is not applicable, I think. Actually, we use the general emission factors for this process. The other sector is the brick company, which closed, so we will not review it in this occasion, but in case that this reopened or a new brick company opens in the country, there is space in the calculator for adding the activity data and everything you need. Going on with the other category that we're going to review is the non-energy products from fuels and solvent use. This has to do basically with lubricants and paraffin wax. We have the 2006 guidelines as the ones that you should use because there are no refinements for this category. And the EMEP guidebook, provides also the guidelines for estimating the road paving with asphalt, which has no GHG emissions. Therefore, there are no IPCC guidelines for the asphalt, but there are air pollutants involved in this process. For lubricant use, you will require the lubricant consumption, which could be retrieved from service or from filling stations, garages, sugar industry, Eswatini railways, etc. All industries that use a lubricant would be appropriate for retrieving this information. The type of lubricant, such as motor oils, industrial oils, if there's a difference between the different type of oils, and the carbon content if there are country-specific compositions or analyses that should be taken into consideration. Okay. In the case of paraffin wax, also the activity data is the amount of paraffin wax used in the country, and this was obtained from Swazi candles. That actually was just a proxy because there was no information from the revenue authority of the amount of paraffin wax used in the country. And even though most of Swazi candle production is exported, it was used as a reference, but this activity data in particular was hard to get and has a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so as the same as lubricants, it should be used if there is any, the consumption per type of wax and the carbon content per type if there are any country-specific analysis. And the third part of the category 2D, domestic solvent use. These are the solvents used in the country. They could be obtained by the Eswatini Revenue Authority, and alternatively, if there's no information of the solvents used in the country, the population is used for estimating the quantity. Okay. And in the last case of road paving with asphalt, well, what is required is the national consumption, which could be obtained from the Revenue Authority or statistics or the Ministry of Public Works and Transportation, which, well, actually we obtained information from the Ministry of Public Works and Transportation, not the just need the activity data of the consumption. Okay, and we have two types of chemicals being consumed. One is the sulfur hexafluoride, which is SF6, used in circuit breakers and electrical equipment. And what you would require to retrieve here is the information on annual consumption or annual purchase, which is what we got. In this case from Eswatini Electric Company, but other electricity generating companies or large companies with their own transmission lines and circuit breakers could be considered. So in the future, it will be relevant to monitor any investments in the energy sector that result in the acquisition of circuit breakers that use SF6. Okay, and then the other product being used is N2O. And what you require is the same, the annual consumption or the annual purchase in the application that's being used, such as chemical uses and propellant in aerosol products. This could be obtained from the Eswatini Revenue Authority or any companies that use this chemical in their process. Okay, So this is the broad review of the 3 categories. Now we will dive into the calculator. As I said, this is being recorded for your future review. We will see the compilation file for these 3 specific categories, and it will be available, the tool for you, so that you can develop the calculations in the country in the future. Now I will share my Excel. Okay, hopefully you can see. I will start with well, now you know the structure of the file. It is very similar to what we just saw specifically in the with the food and beverage industry in the 2H other tab. It's very similar. Okay, so in this case, for the 2A mineral, what we require is, as I mentioned, and give me 1 second. I'm having some trouble with the. Okay. Here, give me a second. Okay. I had some columns frozen. So in this category, we will go straight to glass production. As you can see, what is added here is the annual production of glass. It's provided by the company. It grows in the same, you can see it's kind of stable by a couple of years in a row, 110, 117, etc. It has to do with the capacity production of the company provided by them. Then we have sugar production. This is not used for the mineral industry because they do not use sodium carbonate in the industry, so I will skip this. Going to glass production, I will go to the emission factors. First, what you need is to know how much CO2 is emitted by kilogram of glass. This is obtained from the 2006 guidelines. You can see it's 0.21 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of glass. And in the case of glass, it's very interesting that, well, the emissions of CO2 include how much of the glass is obtained from recycled sources. And in the case of Eswatini, the company obtains 100% from recycled glass. Okay, and I will show you this here in the emissions. You can see this formula. There's a 1 minus 100%, so a 1 minus 1. So this is the activity data per the emission factor is multiplied by the 1 minus the code ratio. So when this is 100%, there are no CO2 emissions, which is the case of the company that has no CO2 emissions. But it does have emissions of air pollutants. You can see that for glass production, there are a lot of emission factors. Okay, there are particulate matter, all for TSP, PM10, PM2.5, and black carbon. And then you can see that there are some heavy metals emitted in the process. This has to do with the heavy metal content of the fuels being used in the furnaces. Okay, it's very negligible actually in the case of the glass company of Eswatini. So I will only focus on these 4. You can see that the first 3 are emitted in terms of production of glass, while black carbon is emitted as a percentage of PM2.5. This is the normal way to estimate black carbon emissions. Okay, and as we have seen before, first we have activity data table, then we have a chart with the emission factors, and then we have the emissions for each of the pollutants where for all the time series. Okay, so this estimates basically this has a conversion factor here for showing this from grams to kilograms to ton. As you can see, these are 2 selected. Also the grams of lead per megagram of glass. This is the emission factor. And the activity data, that is glass production, is used for all the emissions in the glass production. Okay, so independently of the emission factor, you can see that it's per glass production, either kilograms or megagrams. Okay. Now, if we go, as I said, brick production, this company already closed. There is no use of sodium carbonate in the sugar industry. So what we will see now, we will go to, if there are no further questions in the 2A mineral sector, I will go on to the 2D non-energy use of fuels, so that we can make it on time with the workshop. Okay, going on with this category, we have 4 activity data that is being used. Okay, we have lubricant use, paraffin wax, domestic solvent, road paving with asphalt, and their emissions. Let me again, this is frozen. I think they'll be better. So with lubricant use, the first one that we will check, the activity data that was obtained was the tons of lubricant consumed. But for the calculation, you need to have it in terajoules. That is a unit of energy. This is a unit of mass, and this is a unit of energy. And the calculation for transforming the tons of lubricant to terajoules is inserted here in this formula. So there's no problem with this. And this happens with all the activity data, that we need to have it for both types of non-energy uses. We need to have both lubricant and paraffin wax in terms of terajoules. So you will probably collect the activity data from paraffin wax and lubricant in terms of tons, and you will have to the tool will automatically change it to terajoules. This is in orange because we had to estimate the information for the years we did not have the data. We only have it from 2003 towards 2010, then again from 12 and 13, and so on. So it would be desirable that you can collect this data in the future and not estimate it from past estimations. This is, for example, the average between the years that we do have information. Okay. This information, on the other hand, for the amount of paraffin wax consumed, was obtained from Eswatini candles. Sadly, there was no information on the imports of candles, which would be probably the largest source of paraffin wax. So the local production was used, but probably most of the local production could be, for example, sold to tourists, and then the candles would not be consumed in the country. So these emissions are just an estimate, and the activity data in this case has high uncertainty. In the case of, well, I will see these 2 emissions first and then go on with the rest. Both lubricants and paraffin wax follow the same logic for estimating their emissions. They have this factor called oxidized during use, which means how much of what you burn is actually oxidized in a reaction with the atmosphere, resulting in emissions. Okay, so it's a factor as a default value by the IPCC, as you can see here, and this one is for lubricants and this one is for paraffin wax use, but they use the same logic. How much is oxidized, what is the carbon content of the lubricant. So this would be relevant if you have different types of carbon content. It would be good to know by type of lubricant. Then the net calorific value is how much energy is generated per gram of lubricant. This is what the conversion for transforming the tons, which would be your activity data, towards terajoules, okay? And the mass ratio of CO2, this is basically a stoichiometry conversion, how much CO2 is emitted per unit of carbon contained in the lubricant, okay? So these are the factors, if you want to see them. As you can see, actually, as being default factors, they are the same for both lubricants and paraffin wax. They are the same factors being used, okay? So in the future, if you would have the possibility of getting more accurate data specific to each type of lubricant or paraffin wax, it would be great. Okay, and the emissions, we have only CO2 here for both lubricant and paraffin wax. As you can see, lubricant use has a lot more emissions than paraffin wax in the sector. Actually, lubricant use is the second largest source of emissions of GHG in IPPU, while paraffin wax is negligible compared to this one. Even though they have the same factors, the activity data is much larger in the lubricant use, okay? And this is for the whole time series. As you remember, we have from 1990 onwards up to 2018, we have actual activity data, and from 2019 onwards, we have projected data for estimating the baseline emissions of the sector. Going back to well, and of course, you know, and I will say this again, then the GHG summary tab, what it does is to retrieve the information from the tab named 2D non-energy use. It retrieves this information from lubricant use and paraffin wax, the one that we just reviewed. Okay, going on with the other two components of this category, which are domestic solvent use and road paving with asphalt. The case of domestic solvent use is actually very straightforward to estimate. It's estimated based on population. In this document, you can find a tab named population data, which has the historic data of population and also the projections up to 2030. So in any case, if it's not possible to, it's not possible to collect domestic solvent data, population works just fine. So the activity data here is here population for all years. Actually, you can see that it's being obtained from the population data tab. And then the emissions from domestic solvent use are only linked to non-methane volatile organic compounds, and it has to do with the EMEP guidelines, and it's expressed in kilograms per capita. So the just as the activity data is in population, the emission factor is as well in kilograms of non-methane volatile organic compounds per capita. So here, actually, the emission factor that was considered, I think it's here in the notes, it was a tier 1 emission factor, considering the lowest end of the emission factor range for countries, assuming that the consumption in Eswatini would be much lower than other countries that were shown in the emission factor possibilities. For example, countries from Europe or other places that would be actually probably more intensive in paraffin, in domestic solvent use consumption. Okay, so we have our activity data would be population, and our emission factor will be in kilograms of non-methane volatile organic compounds per capita. So the estimation of these emissions that you can see here for domestic solvent use would be basically the multiplication of both of them and the conversion factor from kilograms to tons, so that we can express all the non-methane volatile organic compounds in terms of tons and be able to compare them between different sectors. Going on with the fourth category of the sector of the fourth component really of this category, road paving with asphalt. Since we do not have the actual information of the quantity of road paving material being used, that would be the total asphalt consumption in the country, what we have is the length of road paved, which throughout the whole time series from 1990 towards up to sorry, I went too far, to 2018, it's always 110 kilometers per year. This was obtained from the Ministry of Public Transportations, Public Works and Transportation. But it would be desirable, I think, in the future, if it's possible to obtain the actual information on asphalt consumption, or if there is any variation on the length of road paved for further years. Okay, so with the length, we can estimate a potential activity data of quantity of asphalt based on this information, that is the average width of a road, the average depth of asphalt layer, the average density of asphalt, so that we can transform the kilometers that we have into the kilograms of asphalt. Okay, so going on with the emission factors that are being used for the road paving with asphalt, there are 5 types of, well, I will separate in non-methane volatile organic compounds and all the 4 types of particulate matter. Okay, so they are all expressed by ton of asphalt, except for black carbon, like we have seen before. Black carbon is estimated based on as a percentage of the particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less of diameter. So here we have all the emission factors for the road paving with asphalt category. And for estimating it, well, as you will see, since we have the same activity data for all years, we will have the same emissions for all years as well. And here we have the results. It's just multiplying the same, we will use the same activity data for all, which would be the tons of asphalt, okay? And what will be changing in each of these numbers will be only the emission factor being used. Okay, so for the first 4, it's multiplying the emission factor for the activity data and the transformation for 2 kilos from grams and 2 tons from kilos. And in the last case, for black carbon, it will just be multiplying the tons of particulate matter of 2.5 microns for by the percentage of this that is black carbon. Okay, so it's very straightforward in this case. And I would love to know if you have any doubts that I could solve. If not, we will go to the last category that we will review, that is the category 2G, and we will be right on time to finish the workshop. Okay, so we have two chemicals being used in other products that are roughly sulfur hexafluoride and nitrous oxide. Okay, so this activity data for each should be the same. That in this, I mean, you should obtain it in the same way. It would be from the industry that uses it, or from the any relevant stakeholders that could share the information, or from the revenue agencies, or whatsoever. In the case of SF6, it's from the Eswatini Electrical Company, which, as I commented through the presentation, it's the same the same purchase for all years, 52 kilograms of SF6. Actually, there's another tab of SF6 that could be used in the same way of HFCs if we had any information regarding the purchase, imports, exports, production, etc. But in this case, all that is done here is that it's assumed that the annual purchase is the same that the annual emission, because all years it's purchased the same. So you will see that imports are always 52 and emissions will always be 52. Okay, so I think it's not any case being more detailed in that, since we have already reviewed how does that spreadsheet work. But just so you know that it's obtaining the activity data directly from that sheet. And the emission factor in this case, it's only the global warming potential of SF6, which is here. You can see that it's very large. It's 23,500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of SF6 emitted. So it's very intensive in emissions. And then going to the emissions, we will see that it's as simple as, well, first we will have the emissions of gigagrams of SF6, which is just multiplying the activity data by the factors of converting the kilograms to kilotons, which is the same than gigagrams. And then if we multiply the gigagrams of SF6 by the global warming potential, which is here, you will have the equivalence in CO2, the equivalence of SF6 in terms of CO2, okay? And if we do the same for nitrous oxide, I will say here that the quality of the activity data was very poor. There was not a lot of traceability that we could get for enhancing and having better activity data. So what we used was the one from the previous inventory that actually was 0 for a lot of the time series up to 1999, to 2000. And then there are some values from 2001 and 13, but again, for 2014, there is no activity data, so we estimated it based on 2013 levels. And then, well, this is projections for the future, which should be replaced for actual data. So in the case of N2O, we have the factor that is the global warming potential here expressed in terms of kilograms of CO2 equivalent by kilograms of N2O, which is 265. And according to the IPCC guidelines, there's also a factor expressed in terms of percentage, where it is assumed that all the nitrous oxide is used. So the 100% of the purchase is emitted into the atmosphere. Okay, so the calculation is the same that I just showed for the for SF6, where the kilograms of, in this case, gigagrams of nitrous oxide is multiplied for the by the global warming potential, and we would have it in terms of CO2 equivalent for all the time series. It's much lower than the SF6 emissions, but it's still included here. So that would be the explanation of this category, and you can see that this category is as well included in the GHG summary. And of course, this chart, what it does, again, it looks in this tab and looks for this code and then supplies all information that is to its right, which would be the emissions from SF6 in terms of gigagrams of CO2 equivalent, or of nitrous oxide in terms of the same unit for all the time series. So I think this would be the end of the capacity building. I would love to know if you have any impressions or comments or any doubts. If not, I will project my screen anyway. There is a space now for questions and final discussion. And if there are none, of course, you are more than welcome to, if you are seeing the recording or the calculation tool or any of the reports that we have submitted, you have any questions that you would like to share with me, I will be more than happy to answer anything. When we send this PowerPoint presentation and the recording, you will have my email in case you need to ask any question. So, well, if there are no questions, I would love Deepa, if you want to say any words, or anyone, please, more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Let's just open the floor for any reactions, questions anyone may have, or just anything you want to say, maybe to appreciate the team.
Thank you, Deepa. Thank you for the presentation. You know, some of us, we are still new into this, so we've been following slowly but surely, and taking it from Tuesday's workshop and today. So we are hoping it's going to help us as we move forward in this sector and help us understand the activities that are done, because it's one thing to follow what is being done and just getting the figures from reports, not having a clue what is going behind those figures. So thank you for this, and the team from Eswatini, it has helped us, me especially, a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Payday. And just to let the team know, Payday works at the Eswatini Environment Authority. And they are doing a anti-waste campaign, looking at banning single-use plastics. So they're doing great work there.
Great. Good luck with that campaign.
Gugu, I can see a reaction from Gugu. Yes. Thank you, Gugu. I can see Namiso is from Ministry of Economic Planning and Development. Nicolette is our consultant, also working on the NDC. Sizwe also, you will probably know. Mambo is from Zambia, who will be doing the cost-benefit analysis for adaptation actions. I don't know, Sabelo. Are you from MEPD, Sabelo? Tabile, hi, Tabile. Yes, I'm not sure about Sabelo. Yeah, Tabile, anything from your side? This is one of the last workshops. We are winding up.
Yeah, thanks, Deepa, and thank you, Sophia, for the presentation. I couldn't add more, but I just noted the comments from Rex, which are actually something that can be taken up after that, especially to include the issues of emissions in the EIA stage. We're hoping that that will be taken up in the future. And also the comment that the issue of pulp and paper, the company has reopened recently. I've just learned that, but they are still recycling cardboard. They're still not starting the process from scratch. So, but maybe those issues can be included in the projections. We need to understand what the plan is first, so that we can probably look at the projections into the future emissions. Other than that, it's been a journey. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Tabile. Well, Tabile has been of great guidance and help in everything related to this work, and the one with waste. she has been our counterpart in everything. So thank you, Tabile, so much for everything too. We've been a great team, I think. Well, and thank you all for participating here. Of course, if you have any doubts while rewatching the recording, as Gugu said, that she will see it again for enhancing her understanding or anything, please feel free to contact us. We are more than happy to help you with anything that you may need.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Would you be putting the recordings on YouTube? Because I find that Zoom sometimes, once you exceed a limit, then we have to delete the recordings. So if it is on YouTube, then at least it's there permanently, and we can refer to it.
Yes, sure. We also will share it in our Google Drive folder, so we will have it forever, the recording. So just to reinforce what Sophia has said, just please contact us if you have any doubt in the future when you will be more involved on this or farther or deeper involved on this. So we will be able to answer everything. So very, very happy to cooperate from our side. This has been a very great job. So hopefully this will not stop here and keep improved in the future. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sophia and Tabile and Deepa, again for all of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And yes, indeed, we don't. Oh, Sabelo is from MEPD. Yes, welcome, Sabelo. Of course, we don't end here with just the revision. We have to go on. There'll be a stock taking every 2 years. There'll be another revision every 5 years. So hopefully we will cross our paths again. So thank you very much. So with that, maybe we can end this session, and we look forward to the recordings. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining, all of you. Goodbye.
Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye.